Hi everyone, I'm Cam, one of the organizers with Twin Cities Zine Fest. This year, because of the pandemic, we're having a virtual fest running from Monday, October 19th till Sunday, October 25th. Check out our website at tczfest.org for more information about events and workshops, plus exhibitor links and info. Also, Twin Cities Zine Fest is partnering with Hennepin County Libraries to present live workshops during the fest this year. Thank you to the Friends of Hennepin County Library for sponsoring this event. If you feel inspired to make more zines after the workshop, free kits with zine making supplies are available to take away at Hosmer Library, Minneapolis Central Library, and Sumner Library while supplies last. On your visit, you can also print or make photocopies of your zines up to 25 pages free. Print or Xerox. Thank you. Just a second. Thank you, Hennepin County Libraries. And welcome, Ms. Harkness. I'm going to hop off.
I'm here. Hi, everybody. I'm going to switch over here to my lovely PowerPoint I have to share. Let me make sure that I'm actually in the presenter mode that I want. Oh, one moment. This is when you're a cartoonist during the pandemic and your job isn't calling into these things. So I've only had to do it like a handful of times. So I don't know all the Zoom etiquette. But really, if you're not really familiar with my work, my name is MS Harkness. I'm a cartoonist from the Midwest, and I spent a pretty extensive amount of my early 20s growing up in Minneapolis. And really kind of why I'm here tonight is to promote my newest book, Desperate Pleasures, which just came out this October. Maybe you guys have seen my work Tinderella around, maybe you haven't. They're sort of connected in that you can kind of read them in order if you want. They are in my life in a sort of linear way. But if you see this blue book hanging out anywhere in the local stores or online, you can pick it up and purchase it without much context, other than knowing that you're in for a wild ride. Because a lot of my work, I'll talk about it briefly here because I do have like examples and such from it. But a lot of it is directly called from my life. It's got its own little bits of spectacle and exaggeration here and there. But I really did start coming up in the past 5 years or so, making zines, making small press stuff. I have worked with a lot of the distributors of small press comics across the country. I've been in the New Yorker, but the kind of through line through all of my work is that I'm the main character, and there's a kind of rules and regulations that I've developed in terms of making work from my life. If you're not maybe super familiar with autobiocomics, maybe you're interested in making them, maybe you're more of a zine person, but the spectrum of work that you can make is really varied. If you think about comics kind of being this media of image and text working together, with memoir, with autofiction, there's even more knives to juggle, so to speak, where you have maybe the truth or the reality of the situation, the perception of maybe you being an unreliable narrator versus doing almost journalism about your life in the form of maybe daily comics that seem pretty close to the events that occurred. But you can see here just a variety of different examples that I've just quickly gathered from Google Images. I'm just going to kind of make some quick generalizations here. If they don't really mesh up with your own understandings of memoir, I'm just trying to get you to think about this stuff. But really, you have all manner of psychedelic, super emotional work, maybe more kind of poetic, more underground, more raw things from the 90s, that kind of black and white stuff that's close to my heart. But there's all sorts of different autobi you can make. And so really, if you're interested in doing this work, you just need to have some kind of rules and regulations for doing so. And I'm going to reference a couple books tonight. If you're more interested in finding out more from these books, or just from the things that I'm saying. You can go over to my Patreon, MS Harkness, if you subscribe for like $1. I've got a really handy post with kind of all my links and bibliography with this. But really with these 5 rules that I've developed just in my own work, a lot of it was developed from this book by Pete Walker, which is about complex PTSD, because guess who has complex PTSD? No, but I would say it's sort of gauche, maybe, I guess, to talk too extensively about my own processing just for my own life. But a lot of, what we need to get through, and a lot of maybe say like the age groups in terms of, 20 somethings, early 30s, the people that are making autobio and autofiction, it kind of comes from some self-help, whether or not we want to admit it or not. But his own like 5 to 10 rules in here about finding a therapist that can do trauma work with you, I really resonated with, just in how I kind of put brackets around my own life for my creative work. So I would encourage all of you to make your own rules. I would encourage all of you to just investigate the things that you value. You can disagree with me, of course, but I'm going to share 5 things tonight that have resonated with me. And the first being to use self-disclosure sparingly. So I've got an example here. I don't know how you can see it, but these 2 pages are actually the same page. One of them has all the dialogue taken out. One of them has this sort of poetic narration included. And I did this page, this piece, for a Lebanese comics anthology. And I don't normally do kind of like poetic, navel-gazing work. And then obviously it's about my life and I narrate parts of it, but it's not really, I don't know. It's not really known for being that emotional in that way, but I wanted to try playing with it because I don't do it that often. I found myself kind of disvaluing it. And so I wanted to kind of go through, write some things, curate and edit them really well. So I have 2 arguments here. One for having the dialogue included, which is to say anything worth doing is worth overdoing. If you want to do a comic like that, there's nothing wrong with that. But ultimately, a story told poorly is a life made small by words. So if you're going to include your stuff that isn't really well, refined, you're going to alienate people and people won't want to read it, and it's just going to be lame. So if you look between these pages, there's maybe one that visually strikes you more. Maybe there's one that you resonate with. Maybe the words really do, pump it up for you. I think they're both fine. But really what I want you to think about is kind of just the same value that you would have for any story, any narrative, regardless of whether or not if you knew it was from someone's life or not. This is a little bit from Mary Karr's Art of Memoir book, which if you're interested in this stuff, I'm trying to see without the glare, she writes memoir. It's very good. This book has a lot of information about memoir. It's got little kind of activities and workshop-y type things. So if you like some games to play and some instructions, as well as just some good little reads and chapters, this is a great book and I'd highly recommend it. And I shamelessly steal from her quite often in this. But she kind of explains that if you're going to make a good story from your life, you need to paint a physical reality that uses all the senses. And we don't always think about this in comics, and that a lot of times we don't include sound because it kind of seems like too superhero-y to do that. And we don't maybe always think about the sense of smell just because we have to draw, and how do you include that? But when you work in tandem with your images and your words, you should be aware of making a sensory experience for your reader. Number 2, tell a story that exploits your own talent. So if you have a talent that is, you have a crazy story you want to tell and you're going to be good at doing it, absolutely tell that story if it's relevant and follows the other rules I'm going to talk about. But also package information about your present self, or your backstory, so it has emotional conflict or scene. And I feel like comics actually could do this better than writing, because you have such an advantage of very easily explaining nonlinear time. So I have some examples in here. This is a little bit from Chester Brown's Playboy. Chester Brown is a controversial cartoonist, whether you love him or not. I've included this bit from his book Playboy about his sort of shame and kind of religious upbringing influencing his pornography hobby that he had in like the 70s, 80s when he was growing up. So these pages in here, I just wanted to include because I think just based on the framing, you really have an understanding of like the reader kind of being a voyeur into his life and like being able to readily judge him. If he included like a bunch of neurotic internal dialogue, these panels would suck. And he's kind of got this trick in this book that's really well utilized of kind of using the shoulder angel to explain little moments here and there where he can kind of give maybe the emotional quality of him going and buying pornography as opposed to him explaining the actions that are already being shown. So really just thinking about how there's plenty of other ways to examine scenes in your life. And I feel like a lot of times narration is just kind of the default in autobio, and it doesn't always have to be. So for number 2, for the disclosure that you do use, you really want to use it to build your narrative and accumulate the trust of your reader. So this is a spread from my newest mini, Rotten, which is rather timely just in that it's set right before a presidential election at a Halloween party at like an art kid's house. And I'm not claiming to have invented the strategy, but on the left side page, you can kind of see that there's all of these conversations that are kind of throwaway and that you can't really quite read through them very easily because they're just thrown into the word bubble. But you pick up a couple keywords in there that just give you the context you need to understand kind of like the political swing of the party, maybe the anxieties of just being that age right before Trump was elected. So you're cutting a form in time. You're trying to get to the point of things by putting your reader in the scene somehow, whether they're, super zoomed in, sitting out, if they're supposed to be another character. There's another example I have in here of Sylvie Rancourt's work. She's a French-Canadian cartoonist, and you can kind of be lazy and just say that she was untrained and that she was like this underground cartoonist. But really, I think it's perfect for her to be talking about what she's talking about, which is being a stripper in a strip club. And so in these pages, she's like trying to describe pitching like an erotic puppet show. And because the drawings aren't like super emotionally heightened, and because she's just going through and explaining things as they happen, it just seems almost more absurd, but it takes you out of maybe the pre-existing taboo you might have for strippers or whatever understanding you might have of like how a bar scene like that might work. So she's not trying to trick you in any emotional way. She's just reporting kind of on what happened. And because her drawings are pretty simple, it does seem a lot easier to digest maybe. Pair that up with Uli Lust's pages here from her book, How I Try to Be a Good Person. Very different tactic. Obviously, she's not a sex worker. She's talking about like a very specific scene she had with a partner that she was very emotionally tied up in. So she's using this framing. She's obviously being very liberal with how she's rendering these forms, kind of trying to heighten the scene, explain all the emotions within it without having to include a bunch of neurotic dialogue about maybe how she feels about this person. So, and then I'm just going through like all my favorite cartoonists right now. So I hope that's obvious enough. Here we got Nina Bunjevac, Canadian cartoonist, but by way of like all the little Eastern Bloc countries that she's talking about in her book, Fatherland. She is amazing in that you're looking at this, it's super hyper realistic. Every drawing in the book is like this, and she kind of never like misses with her illustration. She's talking about a lot of like internal family violence and just like the kind of right-wing sociopathy of like her father and grandfather. So she's got these drawings of this kid like murdering a cat in an oven, and it's like just the right amount of information for you to get to where you need to be mentally. Doesn't need to show a bunch of gore or take you out of just this person's maybe value system. But can't recommend that book enough in that all of the art, all of everything she draws is just so on point. And then a shameless plug for my own book. This is from Desperate Pleasures. This is a spread from a bit of maybe like 30 pages that I did all mostly wordless and in graphite, which was just talking about my family in the early 90s in sort of rural Oklahoma. So just giving you enough information, putting you just enough in the scene where it does seem very grotesque and it is very difficult, but not necessarily heightened up in a way that I guess would be kind of disgusting. I don't know if that's maybe the best way of putting it. But really, I've shown you a variety of different materials, a variety of different ideas here, and that we've got sex and violence covered pretty well. But you really do need to make considerations for how your materials are going to affect, say, the emotional quality of a story. A lot of times we just think of our defaults being, you know, what we know. Like if we always draw on a computer, we always draw traditionally, like this is just how the story is going to be rendered. But you really do have to think about how that affects the stories that you can tell, or just the pre-existing biases that your readers are going to have for that material. I'm often compared to the 90s autobio cartoonists because I do in black and white stuff. So, and I'm fine with that. But also consider your format. Consider the length of maybe the story you're trying to tell. If you're maybe trying to stretch it over a book when it doesn't necessarily make sense to. There's plenty of great minis that I've read. There's plenty of great strips and small stories that exist great because they are that length, because they are quick and to the point and the pacing is perfect. So just making sure that you're honoring whatever experience you want to tell and not trying to short sell it, maybe because you only are used to making minis. And then just the defaults and biases that you have, as well as your readers. This can be expanded pretty widely over just making considerations for the fact that if you're cartooning something, you're simplifying something. So if you're representing big abstract ideas, groups of people, ideas about class, about sex, about gender, race, etc., you just need to be really aware of who you are, and then maybe just your audience, say. So if your audience is of a certain, I don't want to say the word tribe, it's a little loaded, but of a certain group, you just need to be aware of how that's going to hit, and ultimately be prepared to edit things and make considerations for other people. So number 3, do not disclose the raw and unintegrated material. And there's varying levels of this. I've included a little bit from one of my favorite cartoonists, Nate McDonough. He's a Pittsburgh guy, and he does a lot of kind of zine-sized mini comics that are mostly autobiographical. And probably can't read all of it, but really he's saying in here, the best autobiographical comics are the ones with the most deeply personal and embarrassing material. And he's kind of griping about maybe the, I don't know, the Instagram comics of our day, or like the mushy emotional things. Kind of goes on to do like the kind of white dude raw stereotype, right? Which is just talking about how shame and embarrassment and sexual stuff at like an early age, you know, made him feel this, and this way. All great, all love it. And then kind of wraps it up to say, you know, at the end of the day, make whatever comics you want. I'm just going to keep doing my dumb rip-off of 8-Ball, whatever. But this really does go into maybe the cliches you've heard of autobio, right? In terms of how a lot of times if you see somebody's work over a number of years, or if you maybe are able to see all of their meltdowns online in addition to their artwork, you're going to see this sort of reoccurring motif in autobio, which I call the shame and embarrassment Ouroboros of filth, which is to say you have a feeling, you start off with some emotional event of some sort, you immediately create comics about it, you immediately go into making memoir and producing something out of that. Immediately, because of the internet, say, or maybe you're very prolific with your production, you're immediately getting feedback on that work, whether it's people telling you you're an asshole, people telling you you're the greatest or an angel. Ultimately, all of that really affects your understanding of what occurred in your life that made you maybe want to make that work, or maybe the characters, the people involved. So then you're performing therapy, but you're not really having this cathartic moment with it. You're just kind of occupying your hands for a good amount of time after the fact. So then your behavior, your art, your creative practice just becomes money or likes, probably more likes than money, for being honest. And then that generates more feelings, which generate more art. And then it's just this constant up and down roller coaster going on. I've exemplified this maybe the best in Julie Doucet's New York Diary comic here, where she's a student at this art college who's working on a project, like pulling an all-nighter, and this other student, this kind of love interest character, comes in and he starts self-harming himself in front of her, and she's, oh my God, trying to run and get gauze. She's like in the bathroom and she's thinking, what a story, what a great project for my art final, right? So you need to have separation and barriers for things, is really just what it comes down to. I myself keep journals. These are some pictures of my journals that I have, which I don't show to anybody, because ultimately I'm not like writing or drawing anything beautiful in there. I don't really have any amazing thoughts. Mostly when I'm journaling, I'm going to the gym and I'm working out and I'm writing in between sets, so I can just like laze around the place and people will look at me and like, oh, it's that weird girl with the notebook, right? But it creates a level of separation. You're getting how you feel out. Very rarely do I go back and kind of dig through these things. I mean, sometimes I do if I'm actually trying to kind of backtrack and work on a book and maybe come up. Really, if I'm doing it to find details, because I kind of already have an idea for what I want to say. And if you have a journaling practice, or say you just write things down in some form, you'll realize that how maybe you feel, or maybe the story you want to tell, probably differs quite a bit from reality, in the way that at the time, maybe you weren't as emotionally connected as maybe you want to portray in your work. So journaling and just having, or meditating, having some level of a self accountability, or having an actual therapist, just gives you some level of accountability. It helps you know when you're full of shit. So if you're going to make a story that kind of paints characters or people in your life with just like a single coat of paint, ultimately, I think your readers kind of can pick up on when you're trying to make kind of scarecrow people in your life to beat on in your work. So oftentimes I get asked how to deal with the other people in your life. And looking at my work, I do include a lot of love interests. In autobio, I would say the boyfriends and girlfriends of the world don't always get their fair shake. I read this list in Mary Karr's book, and kind of was high-fiving myself, because there's a lot of things on here that I do agree with, and there's some things that I don't. But just a couple that I'll pick from here. Number 7, it says, let your friends choose their pseudonyms. I have done this where I have, whether I've had to clue people into the fact that I do autobio, or they, maybe sense something is coming where they're included. I'm usually having a conversation about how they want to be represented, if they do at all. And just making sure that they don't feel an undue amount of anxiety because sometime down the line they might appear in some way that freaks them out. I will, right hand to God, say I've never had an interaction like that where I've had somebody come up to me and accuse me of any falsehood, because I've had these conversations with people and taken this time. I will say maybe one that I don't agree with, or one that I don't do on here. I believe she talks about at one point how you don't want to sit anyone down until you have a finalized product. And really, I think that's more of a writing thing than a comics thing. Comics take a really long time to make. And you can kind of approach someone, I generally thumbnail things when I write. You can kind of approach someone with an idea and explain a scene to them and kind of pitch it to them, and how you're talking about it in the context of the book before you do all the drawing. There's lots of times that people ask me to look at their work, or want to, I don't know, not critique my stuff, but come to me with a finished product and expect me to tell them to change things. And I'm like, I just never want to do that level of editing on anything. So make sure that at some point in your process, though, whatever you're doing, you're making time for other people that you're going to include. And number 11, the last bit on here, let your reader know how subjective your point of view is, which isn't to say every comic needs to have an unreliable narrator character, but there needs to be some acknowledgement of the fact that like you're reporting on your point of view, and it's not necessarily this godlike review or understanding of the world from heaven that is almighty and interprets everything. The more that you leave yourself open in the way that you describe yourself as, you know, being a human being that makes mistakes, you give your reader a lot of trust and allow them to make, you know, assumptions, and broaden their own understanding of maybe how the story will play out, or make them more interested because you're not this, you know, cut out character. I'll say I have an example in my work, and that in Desperate Pleasures, and in Tinderella as well, really in all of my work, my younger sibling comes up, and in Desperate Pleasures, my younger sibling identified as a male. But over the course of me making the book, and then going into what will be inevitably the third book in the series, which I'm writing right now and kind of putting together, I have a little sister now, and she's trans, and that's great. And so I didn't want to have all these situations and setups where she was coming to my book readings and people were maybe dead naming her or just treating her in a way that made her uncomfortable, or just made her have to think about anything, right? Because inevitably, like, I'm her older sister, she should just be able to come and hang out with me, and it shouldn't be weird. And at first it was kind of a conversation where it was like, oh, you're the artist, just do whatever you want. And I was like, no, I know what I'm doing, and we need to talk about this, because like, this is your life. And there's a lot of power too to how you can, say, interpret your friends' physiques or their names or their attitudes, or just maybe scenes where they're their worst or their best. So you give people their own empowerment back if you're kind of making it a collaborative experience for them. And so on the right here, I have my sister's like initial character design, which I was like talking to her and sending her photos of, being like, you're gonna be way more femme as the story goes on. We've just like sped up your transition in time, but it makes sense in the way that the story's told. She's like, it's fine, it's whatever. So that's a very specific experience. But really, ultimately, you know, your book is your book, but these people are going to stay in your life. So the whole, like, I didn't come here to make friends shit's kind of played out in terms of making creative work. On this next slide here, I've got rule number 4, which is just to say, don't create commercial narratives for therapy. I'm going to take a sip of my drink here. So good. And this is another list from Mary Karr. I really do want to highlight the commercial bit in this rule, because art therapy is completely valid. I think that if you want to make comics for therapy, that's entirely fine. But when you start to commodify your work, because comics are historically meant to be mass produced and shared, it gets tricky very fast, and you can kind of quickly fall into that sort of like shame Ouroboros kind of thing I was talking about earlier. So she talks about a lot of good reasons to not make memoir on here, which is to say number 6 is maybe one of my favorites. If you want revenge, just hire a lawyer. Like, writing and just in literature takes a lot of time, and comics takes an obscenely long time to make, to finalize, to produce, to mass produce. You shouldn't be trying to insert a whole therapeutic process into something that is inherently a project with deadlines and other people involved, maybe, if you're publishing it. It's not keeping yourself very safe. If you're doing it for therapy, and number 5, just go hire somebody to talk to. Your psychic health should matter more than your literary production. And if you make comics, if you make any autobio, you know that there's times where maybe you don't want to make it. And your own development as a person shouldn't be stalled on doing that. It's hard to do. And I will say that, you know, I do understand the more that I make autobio, the more that I realize like how much I do get out of it in terms of it influencing how my brain works, just as like someone who thinks visually, someone who almost thinks in like 3 and 4 panel strip, right? In terms of how things can be funny and how things can be a gag. But at the end of the day, you got to be a human first. Number 9, if you're a right fighter, someone who never apologizes or changes her mind, you don't have the fluid nature to twig to the deep river of truth when the spirit draws your forked stick. This is a very good one. It's not necessarily like your morality holds you back from making good work, but you need to not be so beholden to certain aspects of maybe your drawing or your writing, because you will have to edit at the end of the day. You're going to have to edit things, not necessarily to lie, but in terms of affecting your own understanding of events, sometimes it might make more sense to include something earlier on in the story, but that didn't happen in your life in a certain way, which influences how you think about things. And it kind of can unravel your own understanding of events, which is why you need to be in a place where you can be a little bit more emotionally detached. Of course, there are amazing mental health comics out there, and this is not to say that people who have made them in the past are horrible people with no boundaries and they're toxic. That's not what I'm saying. But you want to be aware of maybe the cliches around mental health comics, and just maybe the levels of distance that you can give yourself to play with, because there's a lot of times where, say in comics, it's sort of like an immersive experience, almost like a video game, and you're kind of expected to be the main person, which can be very triggering for other people who have mental health hooty-hoo, which isn't necessarily bad, but it's something to think about. We've got Haley Buck here on the left. Both of these comics were included in Josh Baer's mental health autobio anthology that he did. Don't remember what it's called. But she's describing a panic attack here in a very real, visceral way, where she's kind of pulling herself out of her body and letting you know all of like the bodily sensations that are still going on. If you end up making something that is very, that you know, you are literally drawing yourself maybe having a panic attack or an episode, like that can totally re-traumatize you just by the visualization of you being in that heightened state. So how do you maybe make it reportage or you journaling or being a third party to that kind of emotional content? And of course, how are you going to feel about the story that you're telling, you know, in the immediacy of maybe it occurring yesterday versus 5 years from now versus 10? Like, usually the case goes with autobios, it's a lot like wine, at least like a big bodied red wine, and that you can cellar that for a good long time. It's probably going to be a lot better of a story. You're going to be a lot less inclined to maybe exploit certain moments of it in a way that might come off as schlocky or gauche. You're probably going to be a lot more zoomed out on a level of which you can judge things more effectively. And at the end of the day, you might realize it's not worth telling. Maybe in that you're just a different person now and you don't really need to put yourself in that anymore. I don't necessarily feel super proud of like the events of my body of work. Like, a lot of the things that I do are kind of fucking and sucking in my early 20s. But at the same time, I realized that the people that have read my comics kind of have an opportunity to grow up with me, which can be really valuable for people that are consuming my work of a same age. So again, the give and the take, the pro and the con of doing these kinds of things. And ultimately, all of it comes down to just pay attention to what's going on inside you, outside of you. If you feel bad making autobio comics, don't make autobio comics. That's really just what it comes down to. Pay attention to the people in your life. Pay attention to your own reactions, your own emotions around your work. Pay attention to if you get reviews. You know, most of the time people aren't going to review your mental health. So if you're looking for that, if you're looking for third-party perspective on how you handle things by making comics about things that you've done, don't do that. Which leads to our last little bit here. Maybe kind of speeding a little bit. But you need to create explicit boundaries so as not to become a narcissistic asshole, right? This little kind of fortune cookie sized bit of writing on the right here, I have taped to my studio desk specifically just to remind me. You should take story inspirations from your life and your community, but you should not turn them into heroic narratives You should not make wish fulfillment narratives. And I kind of ride this line pretty hard, I will say. Just in that I do have like a kind of wrestlers WWE spectacle, fireworks and explosions element to my autobio. And it kind of does seem like I'm kind of making myself holier than thou at times, and in the way that I portray myself as maybe being cooler than I actually am. But you just need to understand, if you cut a character from a whole cloth, it's not a three-dimensional character. If you make somebody that fills a trope, it's not going to strike your audience as very thought of. It's just going to kind of be like, whatever, I already know how this ends. I don't need to read this. And then blame, which is maybe to say, as it's maybe been more traditionally used in memoir, which is to say maybe blaming your parents or blaming a bad boyfriend. It makes deep compassion impossible, in that the way that maybe you can reconcile characters or feelings, you're not really doing justice if you're making a story where maybe you're the hero and the world is the villain, right? So a whole bunch of information here. I'll go over it in a way that makes it palatable. But really, with this rule that I have, it's just, you need to constantly be on a journey of self-awareness over your life. You need to be really aware of who you are. You need to pay attention to your thoughts and feelings. But also just like, what's motivating you to make this work? Ultimately, why is it important that you tell these stories? On the left-hand side here, with all of these words that I've thrown in, this is another bit from Mary Karr, where she's talking about her master's classes she has in writing memoir, where she gets students to talk about trying to get them to kind of peel back a layer and maybe not just try and perform a personality for a reader, but to do some more journaling, to ask more questions of themselves, to say, like, what do people usually like and dislike about you? Like, what are your talents? What are your shortcomings? Oftentimes she kind of reflects in her teaching that students will come in with a kind of like, I'm going to tell this cool story about how cool I am, and maybe I'll kind of like use the voice of another writer that's really cool to kind of, because people often will short sell their experiences, and that maybe they feel a little insecure about telling them. Just because maybe, you come from a small town, or you think, there's not very many people like you, or maybe you think there's a lot of people like you, so you don't really see the importance of your own experience. And so maybe, sometimes we just parrot other people's styles or how they present themselves. I feel like there's a kind of, I'm going to make generalizations here and you can disagree with me, in terms of like the gendered binary, the boring stuff, but the historical stuff in Autobio, where you have like the dude underground cartoonist that usually draws himself really gross because he's got all these bad opinions and he's a horrible person and he's going to do horrible things. So he's like all nasty and drippy and barfing all the time. Like that's the kind of historical white dude cartoonist thing. Whereas the chick one can kind of go into that, especially that kind of like 90s, the women's comics kind of stuff. Or maybe you just think of like how they can disrupt the sort of boring, thin, white featured kind of beauty standard. Maybe they're a little bit gross, maybe they're a little bit weird. But as time's going on, you'll have a lot of women drawing themselves cooler, more jacked, more skinny, cool leather jacket, big cool hair. However they want to be represented, they're finding a way to do it through their memoir by maybe making themselves more interesting on paper by their own metrics. And then you have, which is to say maybe like what's going on right now. There's a lot of non-binary trans cartoonists, and I'll again apologize if I'm not saying the correct vernacular. Disagree with me, please, write about it. But you'll have a lot of people maybe wanting to present themselves to whatever metrics they prefer, but you'll also have people representing themselves as animals, as like amorphous blobs, as robots, as all these other things, just to disrupt maybe your own pre-existing understanding of the ideas that can come from a specific vehicle. So I would encourage you to examine history. I would encourage you to examine its shortcomings in terms of maybe those representations. And I'm just talking about the kind of standard white Cartoonists they teach you in art school. But there's a lot more out there than just that, and maybe you're coming to the table with an experience that's outside of that, and I think you should totally make autobio. So and with the rest of the text on here with Mary Karr, she also asks other people to answer these questions for you, which is to say to ask other people, like, what are the things that you think of when you think of me? What are maybe parts of my personality that are distinct to me? And in short, at the bottom, it says, how are you trying to appear? This is really small text for me too. The author of a lasting memoir manages to power past the initial defenses, digging past the false self, to where the truer one wants to tell the more complicated story. So this can get really deep, and it can get really uncomfortable, and you might feel really uncomfortable with this part of the process, which is to say, if it's really tricky and you're not ready to do it, you don't have to make autobio or memoir comics. But I will say it does get easier in that once you kind of do this initial self-investigation, and maybe you kind of resign yourself to kind of powering through and making a work that is really, really good and long lasting and is needed in the world. These are just the questions that will be coming up. And if you know the answers to them before your readers, it's generally better than finding out somewhere along the way. So on these two comic panels, or these two pages that I have side by side here, I actually did an anthology called Silence, which was with Tinto Press, which is a micro press, where I had a bunch of autobio cartoonists write something, and then I kind of played God, and then I took their script and gave it to a different autobio cartoonist. And really, this was just a guise, so that way I could work with Nate McDonough. He did a kind of generally just a story about having taken acid and kind of having like acid rambling thoughts and buying this like Arizona iced tea from a gas station in the summer. So interesting in that usually he kind of has that style of drawing himself kind of exaggerated and gross and weird. And I just played it straight. I did it kind of in my own style, and that like I didn't try and force his hand in anything. But there's other little things to be gained in terms of taking out some of the things that maybe are more closely associated with a certain cartoonist, a certain writer, right? If you take away one of their hat tricks, what are you left with? And it's, not to make a value judgment on anything, but it's just to say like what happens when we maybe draw something differently, use a different material, use a different format, right? Like analyze those things that are usually givens with your work. So kind of in short, if you watch this and maybe didn't think of anything or generate any thought, I just said, get it how you live. The best autobio has the most editing, just period. Ultimately, the long-standing, lasting stuff usually makes a lot of considerations for its readers, for the events. The stuff that kind of stands out the test of time usually requires that, just because you have to actually formulate a narrative within the truth. And a little bit just in that, whatever considerations that you maybe have in terms of saying, or, short selling your experience or short selling your story, you're never really going to know the value of your own life experience. It's not really something that you can clearly see gauged in any way. And so I really would discourage you from kind of putting yourself in a place where you say that you can't make autobio because your experience is to this or to that. If you end up making autobio, if you end up making comics, period, you're going to be part of a really rich tradition of people that aren't necessarily in competition with you for having a more interesting life or having a better story. But we're all kind of working together on the same thing, which is just being alive and getting through it to some extent. So we're all working in the same spirit, and that's cool. So that's what's up. So I've included in the very last part of this presentation, this is the last slide, some handy tips for healthy conflict resolution, which came out of this same complex PTSD book. So just as a public service announcement, if maybe you're like me and you grew up in a house where people didn't say their feelings correctly, And maybe at the end of the day, you just need this information and you don't need to make autobio. You can totally go to my Patreon for more information on this. It's archived and tagged so you can find it. And ultimately, if you're interested in talking about autobio, you can follow me on social media. You can message me about these things. My Instagram tag is m.s.harkness. I'm on Twitter, but I barely tweet. I wouldn't suggest following me on that. And just going neatly all the way back to the beginning of my presentation, if you found this really interesting, maybe you read Tinderella or some of my minis, please go and you can either order Desperate Pleasures from my website, msharkness.com, or you can go to the Uncivilized Books website and you can get it there. They're sending out the pre-orders right now. So if you've already pre-ordered it, it's probably going to come the next day or two. So that should be it from me. Trying to see if I can't get back to Zoom here. But I hope that this was at least informative. Can I get back to my thing? Where's Zoom? I don't know. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. I hope that maybe, if anything, it's just kind of helps you think about making memoir autobio comics in a way that just stimulates you to work, whether or not you agreed with me or not. So I hope you enjoy the rest of Twin Cities Zine Fest. Follow me, do all the things.